Hey everyone, and welcome to the Ncast. I'm Guy Weissmantel, your host and Executive Vice President of Marketing here at Ncontracts. In this podcast, our subject matter experts from across the company will be talking with industry thought leaders about relevant topics and trends in compliance and risk management for financial institutions. You'll learn the latest tips and tools to manage risk in this ever-changing environment. Let's get started.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Ncast. My name is Rafael DeLeon. I'm the Senior Vice President for Industry Engagement. And today I have a guest, Dave Coffaro. And I'll give you a little bit about Dave's background in just a minute. But what I'd like to really talk about with Dave today and address during this podcast is how financial institutions can build strategies that work. Addressing relevance for institutions, I think, again, what we're seeing in the modern change and how quickly things are disrupted. Where do people address and anchor themselves in relevance? How strategic leadership really plays a key role into setting the overall strategy. Dave and I will spend some time talking about, is there a new normal or a status quo and what that looks like? And then if we get time to it, I'd really like to talk about how culture plays a part in an organization and maybe even have that as a tipping point for one of our following podcasts. So my guest today is Dave Coffaro. Dave has broad financial service experience that includes leadership positions in commercial banking and wealth management. Dave is a strategic advisor. He's an executive coach, keynote speaker, and an author. Dave is a principal of Strategic Advisory Consulting Group and also a co-founder of Atticus, a fintech firm providing easy-to-use, do-it-yourself tools for fiduciary-based activities. Dave's expertise is in guiding organizations in defining, designing, and deploying business models to help them deliver their vision. Dave also has a very strong reputation for developing executives in the practice of strategic leadership for the benefit of organizations and stakeholders. And that's why I really think that Dave is just a great person to be talking to today. Dave is a prolific writer. He's been published in different periodicals like Lead Change, Smart Brief on Leadership, the ABA Banking Journal, Psychology Today, and is also the author of 2 books. One of them is Leading from Zero, 7 Essential Elements for Earning Relevance, and another book on Leading from Where You Are, 7 Themes to Make a Meaningful Impact in Your Work, and they're both available on Amazon. Dave earned a Master of Business Administration degree in Strategic Management from the Peter F. Drucker Graduate School of Management at the Claremont Graduate University, and has an undergraduate degree in Organizational Behavior and Business Administration from California State University, Fullerton. So Dave, welcome.
Rafael, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Again, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about a lot of different subjects from when we first met about 2 years ago, I think it was, or if not 3 now, at the American Bankers Association, one of their events. And it's continued to lead through a lot of productive discussions. So as we jump right into it in terms of building strategies that work, I think, again, one of the questions is the dynamic nature of what we're dealing with, and the COVID pandemic has really accelerated the pace of change. What are your thoughts on that? How do leaders prepare themselves?
Well, first, what you said, Rafael, is that COVID accelerated change, and I completely agree with that. I mean, there's no question about it. COVID was shock and awe to financial institutions and really to every company, every business on the planet. I saw something from Gallup, and it said that globally, that 1/3 of all employees or businesses, 1/3 of employees either lost their job or lost their business. So think about what that means across the planet. 1 billion people affected in their business, and banks are no different. So that said, COVID was truly an accelerant for deep-seated change that I think was already in process in financial services industry. So a couple of specific examples that come to mind for me. Look at the expansion of digital tool availability and use. So this is true across small, medium, and large firms. And I saw something in Bank of America's earnings report that said that last year, 85% of their deposits are now made digitally. So they're a huge firm, but I know that that's true for other firms, and more companies are starting to use those tools for digital deposits. McKinsey put out a report that came out toward the end of the year for 2021. They found that 82% of Americans use digital payments of some sort.
Right.
So it tells us it just sort of pushed things further faster. But really through every phase of COVID, financial institutions, clients had to adjust how they engage with their bank or their institution. And, because face-to-face wasn't even an option early on. But overall, I think in a lot of ways, banks took the opportunity to accelerate change. They did some really amazing things. Think of the PPP era and how quickly banks adapted to that. And what an amazing job community banks, mid-sized, large banks did, demonstrating agility, demonstrating resilience. So it was an accelerant, but there were a lot of things that it just sort of pulled up to the surface, really.
Well, when you talk about the accelerated pace of change and using digital or remote deposit capture that, you saw there, my dad's a great example of that. At 83 years old and a former banker, before the pandemic, anytime he had a deposit, he would still go to the bank and go up to see the teller and make the deposit. COVID shifted that where he's using Instacart to do his shopping, something I never would have thought he would have done at this age. And then I was able to walk him through the process to do remote deposit capture, take a picture of it with his phone and make the deposit. So his life has become simpler, and it really kind of defies that adage that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But I think, again, it's really demonstrated that accelerated pace of change that banks, but more so their customers are expecting.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, when we're talking about these things, I often hear bankers talk about how difficult it is to develop a strategy because of the challenging headwinds and the pace of change where things are changing and adopting. What is your response when you hear something like that in your consulting group?
Well, I do hear that often. And I think that part of the challenge is recognizing that developing strategy is not an event. It's not something that we do just because COVID happened or just because there's an economic event. It's an ongoing process. It's something that has to be continually refined. And really at the heart of effective strategy work is recognition that the operating environment is always in motion. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said, all is flux. And we're certainly living that right now. But I think when bankers develop that strategic leadership perspective, they're able to look at the horizon and say, what does success look like in the future state? Not just today, but what will it look like tomorrow? And then how does that future state picture inform our actions today? So I think the best place to start is asking the question, what is the future state vision for this bank? And it's more than things like ROE, ROI, things like that. Those things are important, but those are measurements. That's not the vision. So once you have kind of that clear picture of what you want success to look like, who you want to serve, how you want to engage with them, where you want to deliver to them, then you sort of have a clear picture about what we want to create. Once that picture is clearly defined, then the leader's job is to deconstruct that into a roadmap from where we are today to how we bring that future state picture to life. And roadmaps, it's kind of like GPS in your car. You know the destination, you know where you want to go, and that's what the vision is. But the roadmap can ebb and flow as things change. So GPS may say, we're going to go this path. Wait, there's something going on. We're going to go a different path. But you're continually adapting to the changed environment. And so, again, going back to COVID as an accelerant, I think it's really important to keep in mind all the things that COVID has brought to the surface in terms of our operating models. And in many cases, we were getting close to time for a change in an operating model anyway. I always think operating models have a finite shelf life. And something like COVID brought to the surface all the things that really weren't working well before. It's kind of like the Warren Buffett saying, it's only when the tide goes out we know who's swimming naked. I think that COVID was kind of that swimming naked event for a lot of banks.
No, I've used that expression a number of times. It's very pertinent, especially working as a regulator. So I'm very familiar with that. But again, I think banks did a tremendous job, as you were saying, pivoting during COVID, and especially when we had to go in March of 2020 and we were all of a sudden faced with lockdown and changing that business model. So you're right. It is about continually evolving and being nimble and efficient. But that wasn't the business model that most banks predicted. I think it highlighted their ability to do that, kind of getting to my point of saying when people think it's difficult, they're doing it day in and day out. I like your analogy, and I use the same analogy in terms of strategic plans as a roadmap where you're going to get from A to B and how are you going to get there. And one of those key aspects about that roadmap and the vision and future state is resources. And so in your book, you talk about resources as differentiators. Tell me a little bit more about how you see that from your perspective.
Well, so first of all, when we think of one of the most important resources that any bank has, it's the people, it's the team members. We have to think of our role as an organization as a differentiator of those resources. Now, there's one philosophy that says we just bring in resources and we use those resources and it's sort of business follows. There's another perspective that says we have an opportunity, maybe even a responsibility to develop those resources. And in terms of human resources, I think the opportunity is to say, what does it take to differentiate ourselves as an exemplar in terms of how we develop people? And so, in context of kind of the battle for talent, think about what it means to truly stand out and be attractive to candidates. Right? I mean, we've got people that are leaving jobs, just up and quitting. Well, one of the things that is so pertinent here is how we show up to employees. I spoke to a group of bank CEOs last year, and we were talking about asking the question. I asked them, how do you differentiate your bank to candidates that are considering coming to work for you? And, I heard answers around the room, things like, well, we've got really competitive compensation plans, or you get good benefits here, and our vacation time starts as soon as you take the job, and those kind of things. Those things are important, but they really don't differentiate you. Those aren't the things that attract potential team members, potential employees. Those are sort of baseline things. You've got to do more than that. Differentiation is where you say, how do I really appeal to what people want? Well, what do people want? We know from research that people want to feel engaged. They want to know that their supervisor, their manager cares about them. And they want to know that somebody where they work encourages their development. So I think really doubling down on that, being crystal clear about who are we going to recruit? How are we going to recruit them? How are we going to onboard them? How are we going to continually upskill their competencies? Even things like, how do we help people decelerate later in their career? I've heard a couple of banks that are talking about formal deceleration plans. How do we take somebody who's got a career's worth of knowledge, but doesn't want to work as much anymore? Is there a way we can capitalize on what they still bring to the party and help them decelerate? So just some thoughts on that.
No, I think, again, is we often have spoken about people as a differentiator, but I've seen studies that the Executive Leadership Board has done when you take two managers side by side and all things being equal in terms of their delivery, but one of them differentiates themselves because they take an active interest in their employees. Well, retention is really shown to increase by over a third just by the manager asking about how you're doing today and interested in your career development. And to me, that's a real differentiator when we're dealing with this great resignation right now and people changing jobs. So, again, if people are changing jobs, what has your research and reading led you to say, why are people changing jobs?
Employee engagement is the number one thing in my view, right? So again, Gallup, who I think does fantastic research in this area, they just put something out last week talking about their latest research and a dip in employee engagement. Now, it's never been great. They do kind of a global study, but it's never been great, meaning on average, what they find is somewhere around 2/3 of all employees across all industries, across all demographics, across all geographies are either disengaged or actively disengaged, right? Actively disengaged, I'm looking for another job. I'm playing games at work, or I'm just not really doing anything meaningful at work. 2/3. That means that 1/3 are engaged. Well, what's the difference? The difference is the way that the organization, for profit or non, engages with their employees. How do they create a path so the employee can see the organization cares about me, they care about my development, they care about my career path? Really interesting study from Harvard Business Review. They found that 9 out of 10 employees, it was around 93% of all people they surveyed, and this was across industries, said that they would take lower lifetime compensation to do more meaningful work. Well, think about it. So we started this conversation talking about the future state vision. How do you create meaningful work? I know what the vision of the organization is. I know how I fit into that. I know how I contribute to that. All those things make a difference. And if you don't feel that, and that sounds touchy-feely, and in fact it is, but if you don't feel that, you're not going to stick around. You're going to participate in the Great Resignation.
Right. I just had a very similar conversation with a good friend, and working at a hospital as a doctor, a challenge of starting new and where their pay is, and frustrated about their pay. But I asked the question differently: what do you like about your job? And the list was endless. So are you willing to kind of trade that off? You're really getting a lot here, more for your money in terms of how they value you, how you're being engaged, how they're using you, that you're learning a lot. So I think, again, it's sometimes talking to people, it is not about money as the answer, but what is the value I'm getting out of it every day?
Yeah, totally.
So as we look at differentiators, and just, we're talking about resources there. And I think, again, your points are right on track and resonate with where I've seen these. The next area is, how do banks really differentiate themselves in terms of relevance? What does relevance look like today, and or sustainability?
From my perspective, relevance is really the key, earning and sustaining relevance. And what that means is pertinence with your customers, with your clients, pertinence with your employees, really pertinence with all of your stakeholders. That includes your regulators or your vendors or your partners. And that pertinence, that meaningfulness, that importance is something that changes. It does have a finite shelf life. So think about it. Think about how meaningful the bank was to the client during PPP. Clients needed them. They were there. They showed up. They did a great job. But it's fleeting. And so once we get past PPP, then the question is, how do I sustain that relevance, that meaningfulness with the client, the customer? So I think that comes down to differentiation. And differentiation is really kind of a recipe that draws on those core strengths of the organization, knowing who your customer is, knowing what is meaningful, what's relevant to them, and also recognizing that's changing all the time. So by definition, differentiation is really capitalizing on kind of what's unique or compelling or interesting to your customer and to your team members as well. But if you go back to Michael Porter and his work on generic strategies, he said there's 3 basic generic strategies. So one of them is kind of cost or price leadership. So that's the no frills, let's just do it cheaper, faster, better kind of thing. Differentiation, which is creating some unique service or approach to delivery, or maybe even a unique product. And focus, which is kind of that niche player. In our business, in financial services, price leadership is almost always a bad idea. You don't succeed through having either the lowest prices or paying the highest rates or things like that. I'll share just 2 quick examples with you. I worked with a community bank in Southern California, about a 12-branch bank, and there was a new chief banking officer for the company, and he was interested in growth. And so his strategy was, let's do a deposit capturing deal. It was a promotion, and we're going to pay the highest rates in every one of our markets. So you can probably guess how it turned out. They attracted a bunch of deposits. I think they lost money on every dollar that they brought in. The higher rates only applied to new customers, so they alienated a bunch of existing customers who are saying, wait a second, I've been with you for a long time. I'm not getting the better rate, and they were unhappy. And as soon as the promotional rates ended, all of that hot money left. So basically, they accomplished nothing. Contrast that with another bank on the East Coast, and they took kind of a really creative approach to differentiation. What they kind of built on was just an idea of foundational financial advice, foundational financial planning. They did not go into the planning business, but the CEO holds a CFP. There are people on his team that have a planning background, CFP, CTFA, and they decided that that was really kind of a competency that some of their key people had. So they recognized that a lot of their customers were really uncomfortable discussing their financial lives, but they wanted some kind of guidance. And that includes millennials who generally don't want a traditional approach to advice, but they know they need guidance. So they created kind of what I call a financial confidence strategy. And what they did is they're just offering this basic advice, basic information. If you're a customer of theirs, you can talk about it in a safe space. And guess what? Deposits grew, loans grew, referrals to new customers grew. So in a nutshell, I mean, it's a great example of differentiation. They applied their core strengths. They know who their customers are. They know what matters to their customer. And they addressed that relevance.
I think, again, I think those are great examples. And going back to a community-based financial institution, because how do they differentiate themselves? And you gave us two really good examples there. But I think as a number of financial institutions are trying to figure out that focus, I think one of those focus, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't it be the knowledge that the employees have about their community, what their questions that they're asking, but it's who you know. It really does get down to that relationship capital.
I agree with that completely. I mean, a huge benefit community banks have is the community.
Right.
They're in the community. They know the community. They know the people. And yeah, you get a lot from market research. It tells you a lot of things, but there is nothing like being in the community. You know, it's sort of like AI is really powerful, but there's something that's even more powerful, which is actual intelligence, not artificial, but actual intelligence. And that engagement with the people that you serve is tremendously powerful. What I think sometimes we forget is, look at all the competitors that want to be in this business, all the fintechs, all the, new models and new ideas. Well, why? They want those customers. Community banks already have them, but they're changing. The customers are always changing. They're dynamic. Their lives are like everybody else's. They're continually evolving. People get married, they start businesses, they get, grow the business, they sell the business, businesses are kind of swapped or what have you. Children are born, people grow up, people pass away. Financial lives are always in motion and the world's always moving. So I think for community banks, for any bank, understanding what's new, what's meaningful, what's relevant to them today, and what it's going to look like tomorrow and the next day and the next day is how you build that relevance for today and for tomorrow.
I agree. And I think one of the other added aspects that you were talking about, what community financial institutions bring, I often talk about there with any, community financial institution, there is already a value proposition of trust that's already established there. So, to retain customers, and while millennials may not be using the bank as much as their parents did, I think there will come a point when trust is disrupted in a larger way, and people will go back and be reminiscent to say, you know what, my parents never had a problem at this bank. I'm going to go back and bank here. Mm-hmm. And I would say that value proposition is another one of those differentiators community financial institutions can leverage.
Yeah, completely agree.
One of the other things you talk about, and I really like how you phrase this, what do you mean by self-initiated disruption? And how can this apply to bankers or leaders working in financial institutions?
There are a few different kinds of disruption. And I kind of start with the assumption that disruption in business is just a matter of fact. It's going to happen. No matter what the business is, there's going to be disruption. And with that assumption as kind of a baseline, it presents leaders with some options. So one of the options is what I call adaptive disruption. And that's kind of saying the world is changing. We're seeing evidence sprout up all around us of the change. And instead of waiting to sort of see what happens, we're going to redefine our operating model now. We want to be proactive in adjusting because things are changing and we want to be on the forefront of that. With self-initiated disruption, it's a little bit different mindset. The concept here is that you're preemptively redefining your path forward, absent any specific threat, absent anything that you can say is changing right around you. You recognize that normal is continually being redefined, and you choose to reimagine your operating approach preemptively. So one company that's outside of our business, but I think is a really good example of this, is Amazon. They started out as a book business. Mm-hmm. And so they rethought what buying books was about. Then they rethought books. And so you think about Kindle and e-readers. They didn't make that up, but they certainly did build on that and said, this is a great way for people to access books immediately, capitalize on the immediacy element. And then the next thing they did is they changed the whole publishing business with Kindle Direct Publishing. So, it's an example of where they kept saying, let's disrupt our approach, redefine our approach. And it's worked so far pretty well.
Good. So it is really that process of preemptively doing this, absent the kind of critical need, I must change or die. It's what can I be doing to leverage off of our strengths, or what opportunities or weaknesses can we address?
Exactly.
The other kind of question I have around this is you're talking about this kind of ongoing strategy that we have, but there's been a lot of changes that have been going on, and especially in terms of banks looking at efficiency and their gains in operations. Talk about, again, this is a differentiator. Because again, I see a great connection with other things you've talked about.
Well, again, it starts with the recognition that normal is continually being redefined, right? As we've gone through COVID, we've gone through feelings of, gosh, once things get back to normal. Here's the thing, is we aren't going back to anything. The world only spins in one direction. And so we aren't going to go back to normal. Normal is going to be continually redefined. And rather than thinking of normal as sort of a destination, I think it helps to see it as a point on a continuum of ongoing change. And so with that, I think we can sort of take a look at efficiency, effectiveness, and the way we deliver to clients. Now, I always like to start with the customer and as well as the employees and say, how do we earn relevance with those stakeholders? As that answer changes, it informs us of how we have to evolve our operating model and where we can gain efficiencies, effectiveness. There once was a time where the perception was banks had to manufacture everything in-house. Everything had to be kind of an inside job. I think it's actually wonderful where we are now that we've evolved our thinking to say, not so much. Let's go to subject matter experts who can help us on specific things that may be a step outside of our core competency. There are things we have to deliver, but they can make us more efficient, more effective if we bring in an outside partner. So I think that kind of that agility and recognition that status quo is really overrated. We're in a point of continuous evolution, and let's think of that across all of the way we operate, our entire operating model.
And that's where I really think it ties in when we're talking about a strategy is ongoing. As you know, I'm on the board of directors of a bank, but I've also been training bank directors for a while. And one of the issues that I bring up is a board and their minutes and what they're looking at really should look like a living, breathing organism that changes over time, that adjusts to different climates, that adjusts to different circumstances. And yet, most of the time I see is a bank operating kind of just at a very kind of, oh, here's what we do every month for our board meeting. But it's almost like it's an autopilot versus, well, how do we change things now when we're in a growth period or things are good versus how do we change things when the economy is slipping and changing, or we're at a crossroads now with inflation? Do you see that often as well?
I see that all the time, Rafael, and it's dangerous, right? Repetition is dangerous. It leads to risks. It leads to missing things that you might create problems for the organization. One of the things that I've done with clients, in fact, I have one client who their board meetings became PowerPoint presentations. And all they did was the CEO would read through and present to the board. What we did is we said, okay, for the next board meeting, we're going to have 3 topics. And they're just themes. And there will be no PowerPoint. And all we're going to do is send those topics to the board members in advance with a series of questions. So for each of the 3 topics, we had a handful of questions. That was it. I'm telling you, it became one of the most powerful board meetings I've ever seen or been a part of, because what they did is they ideated. They talked about things that were risks that they had never talked about in the typical CEO PowerPoint presentation or the traditional, here's the agenda. Now, at first, there was some resistance to it because they're going, yeah, but we've got all the stuff we have to cover. Yes, that's true. But by having this block of time, and I think we did like a 90-minute block that was just around open conversation on 3 topics, they had such a productive session that it cast the topics for the agenda for the rest of the year for them. Mm-hmm. So thinking about things differently is very powerful, and avoiding the trap of repetition, which really leads to ineffectiveness and all kinds of problems.
Well, you just teed up again my next point that I wanted to raise. Where does culture play into that? And how does that impact an organization?
Yeah, culture is everything. One of my mentors, Peter Drucker, said, culture eats strategy for lunch. And it's so true. You need both. But culture is something that I think we as leaders of organizations have to be mindful of, and it has to be intentionally designed. Now think about it. In an organization, every time you bring on a new employee, you've added a new ingredient to your culture. Every time somebody leaves, whether they're just departing or they're retiring or whatever, you have a change in the composition of your culture. So leaders have to be really mindful about what they want the culture to mean. What are the values that support the culture? And how do we keep those anchored in alignment with our vision? So my perspective is vision and values don't change an awful lot. Other things will evolve around it. So being cognizant of the fact that culture is an intentionally defined recipe. We've got ingredients that are always changing, and we need to be really intentional about what we want that to mean. It makes a huge difference.
Well, speaking on that and culture, but the intentionality, that's one of the reasons that I really appreciate working here at Ncontracts. The founder and CEO, Michael Berman, really has a very clear vision for where and who he wants Ncontracts to be. And that's even followed up by a book that he's written on the upside of risk, which again, as we were talking about Amazon, really ties into this. But what's a differentiator for me is coming from my background. He and I can sit and geek out and talk about risk management. This isn't somebody that just said, oh, let's build a fintech, reg tech company. Let's do this. He understands this from the bottom up and how these regulations impact the bank, how they impact profitability. And again, one of those other differentiators, but more importantly, how it grounds the culture here in terms of this is the vision. This is now demonstrated and documented in a book that he's written.
Wonderful example. I think that's fantastic, that the culture is an element, or it's driven by what that vision is, and that guides everything else. I mean, in its sort of full implementation, I believe that informs everything to how we choose what we do and what we don't do. I love it when a bank says, that's not our thing. We don't do that. That's just not us. Or any company, because they're so clear about what they do that it makes it so easy to say, we don't do that. And it's just too easy for companies to get distracted and then lose their edge.
So when you talk about these things, especially with culture, kind of we're talking about the good aspects of it. I think there's also bad aspects of it because, again, it really gets back to it's poorly defined or culture ends up sending different messages. And I see the recent spate of enforcement actions that are levied on financial institutions. And many of these I pick up and read. First thing that comes into mind, this is a culture-based problem. There's another one of the big institutions which you work for, which was kind of known for a lot of these issues in California, opening up accounts that weren't done. Can you talk a little bit about this? And I'd like to even have this as a subject for something we could spend more time on later.
Yeah. So culture is everything, and culture defines what is acceptable and what's not. And so I think by being really clear about culture and values and vision, it helps keep the organization moving in the direction that it's supposed to. From my perspective, defining risk and, as a result, compliance as kind of a dynamic nature and determining that we as an organization want to be exemplars in this. It's not something we have to do or we're stuck with doing or will do, but don't want to do. And saying, okay, hold on a second. Let's take a step back. How do we make this just part of who we are, which is culture? I think that makes a big difference. And it also goes to that notion of normal being continually redefined. Now, my hypothesis on the increase in enforcements, I get the OCC daily updates and all of that, and I'm seeing the same thing you are. I suspect that's culture has a lot to do with it. My hypothesis on this is that risk exposure is evolving faster than a lot of banks are refining their risk management and compliance processes. So, Rafael, it's kind of like what we were talking about saying, this is the way we used to do stuff in the risk arena, but it doesn't really fit today's risk arena because it's always changing. So I think this is where banks need to kind of capitalize on economies of experience, economies of knowledge, with an outside partner potentially, because think about it, we're really good at what we're really good at, but we don't see everything in the organization. And what is extraordinary for my bank may be ordinary for somebody else. And that's where I need to bring in the expertise. It reminds me of a friend of mine who went through a really tough experience. She was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and it was just a scary thing. And she ended up going to Stanford Medical in Palo Alto and found a doctor who that's all he does. He is like a leading, maybe a world leading expert in this area of kidney disease. And so after he went through the analysis and everything, he said, I want you to understand, I know how scary this is for you because this is a once in a lifetime thing for you. I also want you to understand this is all I do. I do this every day, and we're going to get through it, and you're going to be fine. I think that's where we can get a lot of value from partners who will be able to say, what's extraordinary for you? It's Monday for us.
So again, even on that point that you just brought up about partnering, I think, again, that is one of the benefits that banks can do. And you're seeing more and more partnerships develop. But what is it that you can help them to do and improve? As again, I look at banks because of the risks that are changing so quickly and daily, that trying to manage risk through a spreadsheet, even for a simple community financial institution, has its challenges. It's not nimble enough. It's not effective enough. It's not dynamic enough to address this quick pace of change.
Yeah,
is that something you're seeing?
Well, yeah. And, I worked for a guy, one of my very favorite bosses ever, who, when talking about the spreadsheet thing, and his view was when you try and distill risk management into a bunch of things you check off of a list, you just lost sight of risk management. And the rationale being is if you're looking and saying, okay, check, 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 you're sort of missing, hold on a second. What's the essence of this risk? What's different about this specific case than the one I looked at last time? How do we understand it? And then how do we properly mitigate it? It's always evolving, and normal is continually being redefined. So I think that the essence of drawing upon subject matter experts who are always looking at what's the next area of exposure, how do we properly navigate that, and then how do we bake that into our process is essential.
Well, Dave, I really thank you for your time today. We've gone through a number of really interesting topics very quickly that I think we can leverage off of for future discussions. But really, again, talking about recognizing an alignment, the dynamic nature that financial institutions are operating within, understanding that resource development can be a differentiator for financial institutions, really looking at self-initiated disruption when there's not an imperative, but you're continually searching the horizon to what can I do differently and better. And then along with that, for financial institutions, especially demonstrating efficiency gains in operations. And that's always one of my big differentiators. That's where you see the differentiator in banks. And those that are partnering with somebody that really has solutions or tools for them to use so they can free up customers' time to spend more of that valuable time meeting with their employees' time to meet with valuable and any of the customers of the bank, because it does get back to what we started with, those relationships that they're building.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, when I was running a division to now in my consulting practice, anything that I can do to create more capacity for my team members to spend more time with clients, customers, in the community is valuable.
Building up the capacity is, again, maybe the subject of our next podcast discussion, along with culture and moving forward. But again, Dave, thank you for your time and your wisdom today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great being with you, Rafael.
Hey everyone, that wraps up another great episode of the Ncast, where we are able to talk with people on the front lines of risk and compliance across the financial services industry. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review. And if you're not subscribed yet, we invite you to do so on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.